The bio I'm about to read you is from the 20th anniversary edition of Darwin on Trial by Philip E. Johnson. I was actually able to sit down and talk with Philip Johnson just a few weeks ago, and it was amazing. Philip Johnson is considered the father of the intelligent design movement, and he was able to tell me a little bit about how he and Stephen Meyer, during this discussion in England, as they were on a walk, I guess, just clicked, and it was sort of the beginning of the movement. Philip E. Johnson is a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Chicago Law School. He taught law for more than 30 years at the University of California at Berkeley, where he is professor emeritus. For the last decade, Johnson has also been at the forefront of the public debate over evolution and creation. He's taken his message to such places as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So the following are excerpts from Darwin on Trial. The British Museum of Natural History, located in a magnificent Victorian building in Greater London's South Kensington district, celebrated its centennial by opening a new exhibition on Darwin's theory. One of the first things a visitor encountered upon entering the exhibit was a sign which read as follows: "Have you ever wondered why there are so many different kinds of living things? One idea is that all the living things we see today have evolved from a distant ancestor by a process of gradual change. How could evolution have occurred? How could one species change into another? The exhibition in this hall looks at one possible explanation, the explanation of Charles Darwin." An adjacent poster included the statement, "Another view is that God created all living things perfect."
Solid science.
A brochure asserted that the concept of evolution by natural selection is not, strictly speaking, scientific. The concept of evolution by natural selection is not, strictly speaking, scientific. The concept of evolution by natural selection is not, strictly speaking, scientific, because it has been established by logical deduction rather than empirical demonstration. The brochure observed that if the theory of evolution is true, it provides an explanation for the groups within groups arrangement of nature described by the taxonomists. The general tenor of the exhibit was that Darwinism is an important theory, but not something that is unreasonable to doubt. Prominent scientists reacted furiously to these relativistic expressions. The forum for the controversy was the editorial and correspondence pages of the leading British science journal, Nature. L.B. Halstead, a neo-Darwinist stalwart, began things with a letter that attacked not only the Darwin exhibit, but also new exhibits at the Museum on Dinosaurs and Human Evolution. What was wrong with all these exhibits, according to Halstead, is that they employed a system of classification known as cladism, which assumes that no species can be identified as the ancestor of any other species. He described the cladistic literature as full of abuse of Ernst Mayr and George Gaylord Simpson, and indeed of Charles Darwin himself, because these great men had adhered firmly to the idea that the processes that can be observed in the present day when extrapolated into the past are sufficient to explain the changes observed in the fossil record. Halstead charged that some of the exhibits could be interpreted as attacking not only Darwinism, but evolution itself. For example, the exhibit on man's place in evolution specifically denied that Homo erectus was a direct ancestor of Homo sapiens, so that what the creationists have insisted on for years is now being openly advertised by the Natural History Museum. The charge of political motivation was good entertainment, but the substantial issue was that the museum's staff was going public with doubts about neo-Darwinism and even the existence of fossil ancestors, doubts that had previously been expressed only in professional circles. Specifically, some of the exhibits were suggesting that the orthodox theory finds its support in a certain kind of logic rather than in the scientific evidence. A report in Nature quoted what one of the museum's senior scientists was telling the public in a film lecture. "The survival of the fittest is an empty phrase. It's a play on words. For this reason, many critics feel that not only is the idea of evolution unscientific, but the idea of natural selection also. There's no point in asking whether or not we should believe in the idea of natural selection, because it's the inevitable logical consequence of a set of premises. The idea of evolution by natural selection is a matter of logic, not science. The idea of evolution by natural selection is a matter of logic, not science. The idea of evolution by natural selection is a matter of logic, not science, and it follows that the concept of evolution by natural selection is not, strictly speaking, scientific. If we accept that evolution has taken place, though obviously we must keep an open mind on it, we can't prove that the idea is true, only that it has not yet been proven false. It may one day be replaced by a better theory, but until then, the reporter commented, "If this is the voice of our friends and supporters, then creation protect us from our enemies." An editorial in Nature titled "Darwin's Death in South Kensington" hammered the offenders with rhetorical questions. Can it be that the managers of the museum, which is the nearest thing to a citadel of Darwinism, have lost their nerve? Not to mention their good sense? Nobody disputes that in the public presentation of science, it's proper, whenever appropriate, to say that disputed matters are in doubt. But is the theory of evolution still an open question among serious biologists? And if not, what purpose, except general confusion, can be served by these weasel words? The editorial speculated that the exhibition must have been designed by someone not in close contact with the museum's scientific staff, because most of those distinguished biologists, quote, would rather lose their right hands than begin a sentence with the phrase, "if the theory of evolution is true," end quote. This provoked an indignant response from 22 of the distinguished biologists who were astonished that nature would advocate that theory be presented as fact.
The theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact.
Evolution isn't an opinion, it's fact.
This provoked an indignant response from 22 of the distinguished biologists who were astonished that nature would advocate that theory be presented as fact. The biologists wrote that, "We have no absolute proof of the theory of evolution." They concluded, perhaps naively, that the theory of evolution would be abandoned tomorrow if a better theory appeared. The exchange of letters and editorial comments continued for months. The editors of Nature belatedly discovered that Darwinism is more controversial among scientists than they had realized, and they tried to take a more moderate line in a leading article on the boundaries of legitimate doubt. This effort, with the provocative title, "How True is the Theory of Evolution?" contributed to the general confusion by making concessions that must have been more alarming to the Darwinists than the exhibits at the museum. The Nature editorial not only implied that Darwinism is a metaphysical system sustained partly by faith, but courted outright disaster by encouraging the museum to educate the public on the evidentiary problems that caused some people to become skeptical about Darwinism. Things could hardly be left at that point, and a few weeks later, Nature published another article which tried to clean up the mess. It asserted that although no biologist can deny the possibility that God created man, few would doubt that, if he did so, the mechanism that Darwin discerned was the one that he chose to use. The museum's duty was not to pander to doubters, but to make the case for evolutionism. Quote, "In the face of the organized pressures of religious and mystical sects, evolutionists need some organization to represent their views, no less fervently held, as cogently as possible. Not that it should descend to the half-truths and double talk of political propaganda.
The theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact.
But it should suit the terms of its message to those who will listen to it, rather than blunting its edge with the hair-splitting logic chopping of the philosophy of science." The Claddists also scored some points in the debate. Particularly biting was the letter from Gareth Nelson. To the dismay, sometimes acute, of the more clerically minded members of this profession, cladistics treat fossils in a secular fashion, not as revelation, but as some among many other biological specimens subject to interpretation that is apt, indeed expected, to be diverse, especially with respect to details. As reasonable as this treatment might seem to the outsider, the emotional effect within such a paleontologist involuntarily confronted with cladistics, as I've witnessed on more occasions than I care to remember, is not unlike that experienced by a fundamentalist minister who has forced upon him, uninvited, the notion that the Bible is just one book among many. Suffice it to say that more than one kind of church has been built upon rock. The view prevailed, however, that it would only mislead museum-goers to be presented with the notion that The Origin of Species is just one book among many. Anthony Flew, a philosopher renowned for defending Darwinism, atheism, and clear thinking, subsequently explained the whole episode as a breach of trust by civil servants, i.e., the museum's scientists, who had a duty to present the established truth rather than to confuse the public with unorthodox opinions. He denounced these upstarts for their abuse of the resources of a state institution to try to put their pet theory, cladism, across to all the innocent and predominantly youthful laypersons who throng these public galleries, as if it were already part of the established consensus among all those best qualified to judge. Flew reported that the offending material has since, apparently and none too soon, been withdrawn. As this comment implies, the museum had surrendered to the pressure. The museum's spokesman explained in a letter to Nature that the staff's attempt to avoid dogmatism in its presentation of Darwinism had unfortunately given an impression other than that intended. The film loop that had called survival of the fittest an empty phrase had been removed at once, and a more general cleanup of the exhibitions would follow. The exhibits contained nothing to alert the casual observer to the fact that there's anything controversial about Darwin's theory. For example, the infamous "one possible explanation" sign at the entrance to the Darwin exhibit had been replaced with the following reassuring message. When we compare ourselves with our fossil relatives, we find evidence that man has evolved. Darwin's work gave strong support to the view that all living things have developed into the forms we see today by a process of gradual change over very long periods of time. This is what we mean by evolution. Many people find that the theory of evolution does not conflict with their religious beliefs. The weasel words in the original exhibit had hinted broadly that there were grounds for doubt about Darwinism, but had given no clear indication of precisely what the grounds for doubt might be. As the museum's spokesman explained in an interview, the exhibits did not refer to such problems as the lack of transitionals in the fossil record, the sudden explosion of complex life forms at the beginning of the Cambrian Age, the difficulty of explaining the origin of the genetic code, the limits to change shown by breeding experiments, the hopeful monster controversy, the punctuated equilibrium controversy, or the importance of catastrophic extinctions. From the point of view of an informed critic, even the original exhibition was more of a cover-up than a candid disclosure of Darwinism's difficulties. The spokesman pointed out that the museum had nonetheless come a long way since the previous exhibit on evolution, when the director, Sir Gavin de Beer, quote, wrote a handbook in which it was said that these days evolution is accepted as a fact, and natural selection is the mechanism for it, full stop. The battle at the British Natural History Museum showed that creationists are not necessarily responsible for the fact that educators tend to stick to generalities when presenting the evidence for evolution to young people. Darwinists are very resentful if their theory is presented to the impressionable in a manner likely to encourage doubts. An explanation of the punctuated equilibrium controversy, for example, is bound to give skeptics the impression that Darwinists are making lame excuses for their inability to find supporting fossil evidence for their claims about macroevolution. No matter how earnestly the experts insist that they're only arguing about the tempo of gradualist evolution and not about whether it ever happened, a few bright teenagers are likely to think that perhaps the evidence is missing because the step-by-step transitions never occurred. To Darwinists, teaching about evolution does not mean encouraging immature minds, or mature ones for that matter, to think about unacceptable possibilities. California is a state with a diverse population that includes many creationists and also a large and assertive scientific community. creationists persuaded the State Board of Education to adopt an anti-dogmatism policy, but more recently, science educators have counterattacked. They pressed the State Board of Education to enact clear rules mandating the teaching of evolution as Darwinists understand it. After much debate, the board adopted a policy statement on the teaching of science. Although the whole point of the new policy is to encourage more thorough coverage of evolution in classrooms and textbooks, the policy statement itself does not refer explicitly to evolution. The educators preferred to make a more general statement about science because they didn't want to concede that evolution is an exceptional case which involves religious or philosophical questions distinct from those present in other areas of science. On its face, the policy statement is reasonable and broad-minded. It begins by saying that science is concerned with observable facts and testable hypotheses about the natural world, and not with divine creation, ultimate purposes, or ultimate causes. These non-scientific subjects are relegated to the literature and social studies curricula. The policy statement emphasizes that neither science nor anything else should be taught dogmatically because, quote, compelling beliefs is inconsistent with the goal of education, which is to encourage understanding. The policy statement even repeats this important distinction between believing and understanding. Quote, to be fully informed citizens, students do not have to accept everything that's taught in the natural sciences curriculum, but they do have to understand the major strands of scientific thought, including its methods, facts, hypotheses, theories, and laws. The policy statement goes on to explain that scientific facts, theories, and hypotheses are subject to testing and rejection. This feature distinguishes them from beliefs and dogmas, which do not meet the criterion of testability and are therefore inappropriate for consideration in science classes. Science teachers are professionally obligated to stick to science and should respectfully encourage students to discuss matters outside the domain of science with their families and clergy. A person unaware of the nuances of the knowledge-belief distinction might imagine that the policy statement protects the rights of creationist students to question the truth of evolution, provided they understand the subject. That would be a misunderstanding, however, because from a Darwinist perspective, it is no more possible to understand evolution and honestly disbelieve it than it is to understand arithmetic and to think that 4 times 2 is 7. To Darwinists, fully naturalistic evolution is a fact to be learned, not an opinion to be questioned. A student may silently disbelieve, but neither students nor teachers may discuss the grounds for disbelief in class, where other students might be infected. The purpose of the policy statement is not to protect dissent, but to establish a philosophical justification for teaching naturalistic or godless evolution as fact in an educational system that is at least nominally opposed to dogmatism. The justification is that science is a world apart because of the exceptional reliability of its methods. Scientific facts and theories are subject to continual testing, whereas philosophical and religious beliefs, quote, are based, at least in part, on faith, and are not subject to scientific test and refutation, end quote. Although compelling beliefs is inconsistent with the goal of education, compelling knowledge is what education is all about. Those who understand the code words know that all these generalities are meant to establish a single specific point. Naturalistic or godless evolution belongs in the category of knowledge, not belief, and so resistance to it stems from ignorance, which education rightly aims to eliminate. The policy statement was followed by a curriculum guide called the Science Framework, which tells textbook publishers what approach to take if they want their books to be acceptable in the huge California market. The framework pays lip service to the principle that teaching should be non-dogmatic, but it also conveys a clear message that the purpose of instruction in evolution is to persuade students to believe in the orthodox theory. The major areas of difficulty are ignored or minimized. Teachers are exhorted to reassure students that science is a reliable and self-correcting enterprise, that allegedly scientific objections to accepted doctrines have been considered and rejected by the scientific community, and that evolution is, quote, scientifically accepted fact. The language in which all this is done seems calculated more to conceal information than to reveal it. For example, the inability of paleontologists to identify specific fossil ancestors for any of the major groups is addressed obliquely in one sentence, quote, "Discovering evolutionary relationships is less a search for ancestors than for groups that are most closely related to each other," end quote. The notorious controversies over the pace of macroevolution are papered over with the observation that gradualism is the rule, except when it is not the rule. Quote, "Although most changes in organisms occur in small steps over a long period of time, some major biological changes have taken place during relatively short intervals. These include the evolution, diversification, and extinction of much fossil life." Finally, the framework includes a table to illustrate the extreme regularity in cytochrome C sequence divergences. This so-called molecular clock phenomenon contradicted expectations based on the theory of natural selection and required the invention of the neutral theory of molecular evolution. The framework comments that the table, quote, "shows how regular has been the rate of molecular evolution in these amino acid sequence changes. Its results are exactly what would be expected and predicted by evolutionary theory," end quote. In its introductory section, the framework's authors extol science as a limitless voyage of joyous exploration and stress the importance of inspiring students with the excitement of the scientific enterprise. That sense of excitement is not supposed to extend to fundamental questions about evolution, however. Students are encouraged to think about careers in biotech, but solving the mystery of evolution is out of the question because Darwinists have to insist that there is no mystery. The interesting conceptual bit has been settled, and only the details remain to be filled in. The framework's most constructive recommendation is that teachers and textbook writers should avoid terminology that implies that scientific judgments are a matter of subjective preference or vote counting. Quote, "Students should never be told that many scientists think this or that. Science is not decided by vote, but by evidence. Nor should students be told that scientists believe. Science is not a matter of belief. Rather, it is a matter of evidence that can be subjected to the tests of observation and objective reasoning. Show students that nothing in science is decided just because someone important says it is so, or because that is the way it has always been done." The framework immediately contradicts the message, however, by defining evolution only vaguely as change through time. A vaguely defined concept cannot be tested by observation and objective reasoning. The framework then urges us to believe in this vague concept because so many scientists do. Quote, "It is an accepted scientific explanation, and therefore no more controversial in scientific circles than the theories of gravitation and electron flow."
Fact.
An appeal to authority is unavoidable because Darwinist educators cannot afford to reveal that their theory rests squarely on what the policy statement calls philosophical beliefs that are not subject to scientific test and refutation.
Fact. It's a scientific.
An appeal to authority is unavoidable because Darwinist educators cannot afford to reveal that their theory rests squarely on what the policy statement calls philosophical beliefs that are not subject to scientific test and refutation. Darwinist scientists believe that the cosmos is a closed system of material causes and effects, and they believe that science must be able to provide a naturalistic explanation for the wonders of biology that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Without assuming these beliefs, they couldn't deduce that common ancestors once existed for all the major groups of the biological world, or that random mutations and natural selection can substitute for an intelligent designer. Neither of these foundational beliefs is empirically testable, and according to California's policy statement, neither belongs in the science classroom.
Scientific fact.
Darwinist scientists believe that the cosmos is a closed system of material causes and effects, and they believe that science must be able to provide a naturalistic explanation for the wonders of biology that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Without assuming these beliefs, they couldn't deduce that common ancestors once existed for all the major groups of the biological world, or that random mutations and natural selection can substitute for an intelligent designer. Neither of these foundational beliefs is empirically testable, and according to California's policy statement, neither belongs in the science classroom. The Darwinists may have made a serious strategic error in choosing to pursue a campaign of indoctrination in the public schools. Previously, the high school textbooks said relatively little about evolution, except that most scientists believe in it, which is hard to dispute. Serious examination of the scientific evidence was postponed until college and was provided mostly to biology majors and graduate students. Most persons outside the profession had little opportunity to learn how much philosophy was being taught in the name of science, and if they knew what was going on, they had no opportunity to mount an effective challenge. The Darwinists themselves have changed that comfortable situation by demanding that the public schools teach a great deal more about evolution. What they mean is that the public schools should try much harder to persuade students to believe in Darwinism, not that they should present fairly the evidence that is causing Darwinists so much trouble. What goes on in public schools is the public's business, however, and even creationists are entitled to point out errors and evasions in the textbooks and teaching materials. Invocations of authority may work for a while, but eventually determined protesters will persuade the public to grant them a fair hearing on the evidence. As many more people outside the biblical fundamentalist camp learn how deeply committed Darwinists are to opposing theism of any sort, and how little support Darwinism finds in the scientific evidence, the Darwinists may wish that they had never left their sanctuary.